Ramadan.
Now, recession risks have been reignited by the recent banking collapses and rescue deals, and there are now concerns that global growth will weaken as the crisis heralds the end of a so-called easy cash era and the arrival of a credit crunch. Banks, that means, are once again in the news. Two bank failures in the United States have triggered the worst turmoil in the banking sector, as it has been described, since the 2008 financial crisis. There's also talk of a lack of trust, of a collapse of confidence, of contagion, and systemic risk. And for you and I, the layman, or at least for myself, this is really complicated stuff. And so to unpack this, we're now joined by Professor Jannie Rossouw, a visiting professor at the Business School at the University of the Witwatersrand. Good afternoon, sir, and welcome to the show. All right, so it looks like the banks are once again in the news, as you put it in the recent article. I think, could you perhaps just give us an understanding of what the situation is like at the moment?
Well, we have to remember that banks, under all conditions, are institutions of trust. People entrust deposits to a bank because they have the confidence that they will be repaid. Loans can be borrowing clients if they have confidence that the funds will pay. When the clients can repay, that pay that.
All right. I think the sound is a bit sketchy right there. So if I can just ask you, Professor, to just move a bit and we can hopefully get a better line so that we can hear you clearly. Nonetheless, thank you for that basic explanation. What are the indications that suggest that the banking system is currently in turmoil?
Well, generally, banks are well capitalized and banks have reserves against unforeseen developments. So I'm happy to say that South African banks are well capitalized, and the banking problems we've seen in South Africa in the last decade or so, those problems were the result of mismanagement rather than of liquidity or solvency problems. We had, for instance, the DBS bank scandal in South Africa, which was really a case of fraud rather than banks that were not soundly managed.
How severe is the current situation, when you compare it to the conditions that had in fact led to the 2009 financial crisis?
Well, the 2009 financial crisis was unique in the sense that loans had been made to people that never qualified for such loans on objective criteria.
Yeah, when we
over loans.
Okay. When we look at the situation, right? So we've seen two banks have apparently collapsed over in America. Do you think this could have an effect on South Africa as well? And if so, to what extent would these developments on a global scale then affect local banks in South Africa and the economy locally?
The recent banking problems in the USA had an effect on the share prices of South African banks. The listed banks all saw declines in their share prices, which again shows that banking is built on confidence, it's built on trust. And if there's any doubt about the ability of banks to continue to operate, we see things like movements in share prices and the likes. However, it did not result in a banking crisis in South Africa. As I've said, South African banks are well capitalized.
So at this moment, would you say there isn't really much need to fear of a similar situation then occurring here at this stage?
Yeah, at this stage, my impression is that South African banking is sound, that we have very good bank supervision from the side of the Reserve Bank, and that the three types of banks that we have in South Africa, commercial banks, mutual banks, and cooperative banks, all three of those types of banks are well managed.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for the interview. Enjoy the afternoon. Bye-bye.
You as well. Bye bye. That was Professor Jannie Rossouw, a visiting professor at the Wits Business School, speaking to us about the reason why banks are in the news again. And as we mentioned, as he said as well, so it appears that two banking failures in the United States have now triggered the worst turmoil in the banking sector since the 2008 financial crisis. And as he mentioned, there seems to be a lack of trust, of a collapse in confidence, and a few more complicated terms, which he did in fact unpack for us briefly, that of contagion and systemic risk. So at the moment, I think Professor Jannie Rossouw seems, his impression, rather, he says the impression that he gets at this stage is that we should not really panic in South Africa. Things seem to be stable and in good standing at present. Let's take a break. When we get back, one of our weekly segments, and that, of course, focusing on youth matters.